Welcome to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX at the luxurious Mirage Resort in Las Vegas. I'm Sarah Peters. We'll be streaming live here at informationweek.com/IW News Desk for the next 5 hours, bringing you interviews with speakers and exhibitors from the show. So those of you here at Interop can watch to get a peek of the things you'd like to see more of, or a glimpse of the things you missed while you were busy doing some other wonderful thing at the show. And those of you at home can soak up all this knowledge and lament that you aren't here with us to enjoy it in person. We'll be talking about machine learning, smart cities, GDPR, leadership, DevOps, all manner of IT topics to nettle the neurons. If you like what you see, tell your friends about it using the hashtag IWNewsDesk. And if you don't, tell your enemies. So, let's get right to it. Our first guest is all over Interop this week, talking about artificial intelligence. I'm delighted to have him here. Principal Analyst of Janakiram and Associates, Janakiram, MSV. Thank you so much for being with me, my first guest.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Well, one of the things that you're giving a workshop here about is enabling IoT applications using AI at the edge. So let's level set there for a minute and talk about what the edge is and why it is so important right now.
Sure. So to help you understand edge, I need to step back a little and talk about the evolution of cloud. So cloud was all like a mainframe computer, right? So it is centralized, it is a powerful data center run by Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, remotely accessible by a lot of customers. So when you actually look at the architecture of cloud, it resembles quite a bit of mainframe. One powerful centralized resource accessed by a lot of terminals, right? So that was the first generation of cloud, and businesses, customers were pretty excited about the benefits of cloud. But eventually, cloud moved away from being just the compute provider, where you could launch a bunch of VMs, to becoming more of a data platform, where customers started to bring a lot of data, started crunching it, and bringing the big data workloads. And the logical extension of that was running IoT in the cloud. So Microsoft, Amazon, Google, IBM, Salesforce, all of them got onto the bandwagon and started offering Internet of Things as a service in the cloud. And that was like the second generation of public cloud, where we started to pivot from compute, which are a bunch of VMs, to more of data and data platform. And IoT drove that use case and that scenario. So when IoT came to the public cloud, a lot of things changed. First of all, these sensors, there are millions of sensors that are streaming live data to the cloud. It is getting ingested, aggregated, stored, and queried. And it was phenomenal because suddenly we have ample storage, abundant compute power,
Right.
lot of processing capabilities. But as IoT became mainstream in the public cloud, customers started to realize that the turnaround time between sensors sending the data, cloud analyzing, processing it, and coming back was taking too long. The turnaround time was too high because of the latency. And when we consider industrial Internet of Things scenarios, customers cannot afford that latency and the turnaround time. So they went back to the vendors, public cloud providers, and said, we need something which is in between the public cloud and our devices that are sending the data, because of quite a few reasons. First thing is, of course, the latency, as I mentioned. The second thing is the volume of data generated by these sensors was so huge that they wanted to filter it out before sending it to the public cloud. So they didn't want to dump every bit of data generated by these sensors. That was the second reason. Third thing is they wanted to apply some transformation, anonymize the data, make it slightly more secure before extending it to the cloud. So in between the devices and the public cloud came in a new layer, which is the edge computing layer. So edge computing, for all practical purposes, is a logical extension of the public cloud, and it mimics the capabilities of cloud. For example, the building blocks of public cloud, like compute, storage, and networks, are actually available on the edge. It exposes a bit of compute, a bit of storage, and even networking. So the devices will talk to the edge, and the edge will be the forwarder, the proxy to the public cloud. And it brings in a lot of abilities like offline processing, local processing, anonymizing the data, securing the data, and providing quite a few capabilities to the end devices.
And we need all of those things to happen. And we need all of those things to happen now, because at every minute there's 8 bajillion new IoT devices
Absolutely.
being connected. So how then is artificial intelligence going to help us with that layer that you're talking about that's closer to the edge?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, edge mimics the cloud, albeit in a low resource memory constrained form. If cloud is exposing compute as VMs, edge is exposing compute as serverless functions. There are databases running in the edge to store the time series database, to time series telemetry data. There is a bit of complex event processing happening on the edge. So all of those capabilities are available. But if you actually look at the rules engine, which is making certain decisions, it is still delegated to the public cloud. So there are 3 aspects in this whole life cycle. There is data that is being generated. Then there are a set of rules that are going to decide what will actually happen to the devices. And then there are actions that are going to be taken. So data, decision, and action. Even though edge came down closer to the devices, the decision making was still left to the public cloud. But guess what? All the rules engines are now replaced by more sophisticated machine learning models.
Right.
So with the rules engine transforming into more intelligent AI-driven engine, customers want to perform the heavy lifting, which is training the machine learning models in the public cloud, generate a model that is quite capable of making decisions, and bring it down to edge and run it there. So we are even bringing the decision making all the way from the public cloud towards the edge. So we are adding more power to the edge, and the decision making is now delegated to the local device. So when the data hits the edge layer, because there is a machine learning model running inside, it can actually make decisions with very low latency, high precision, high accuracy. And these models are always generated in the public cloud, but they are getting pushed down to the edge to perform these actions. So it's a spectrum. Learning takes place in the public cloud, decisions are driven by the edge, and action is taken by the devices. And this continuous spectrum is iterative process. Customers make the machine learning models learn in the public cloud, push them down to the edge for the decide and the decision factor, and then the devices actually perform the action.
Well, I'll tell you, Janakiram, I usually interrupt people a whole lot more during an interview, but I stopped because I was learning so much from you about artificial intelligence, and I am sure that all of the attendees are going to learn quite a bit from you at Interop this week. Unfortunately, we're out of time today, but thank you so much for being my first victim at the Information Week News Desk. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
That's Janakiram, MSV. Stick around. The Information Week News Desk will be right back after the break.
It's Lenny Liebman of Information Week, and I'm here at Interop ITX Las Vegas with Robert Koenen, who's VP of Business Development for Interoptic. Robert, it's good to see you.
Hey Lenny, it's great to be here.
Before we talk about optics themselves, I kind of want to just talk about third-party or brand equivalent optics, because I think some of us have been involved with them and had some bad experiences because of gray market product coming in. So I think you ought to share about that first.
That's true, Lenny. Pretty much every data center architect has a horror story about malfunctioning cheap third-party optics that they tried and failed with. Unfortunately, over the years, there's been a lot of very poorly tested, poorly engineered optics being dumped on what's called the gray market, even by companies who've been in this business for several years. The reason for this is that these optics aren't that expensive to make, especially the older generations, but they're very expensive to test. And so that's where they tend to, cut some corners here and there. And so in order to make sure you don't get high infant mortalities and that sort of thing, they skip on that and they just dump it on the customer. And it's like, they won't mind if like 1 out of every 20 or 1 out of every 10 dies in the first 3 months. But for the most rigorous companies, they care about this. They're going for 6 nines. And that's one of the reasons why Interoptic came into being, actually, was our interactions with huge customers, the federal government, stuff like that, very exacting requirements. And that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, and that's probably true of a lot of things, right? It's easier to do it than it is to get it absolutely right.
Exactly.
And do you see any forces in particular driving additional appetite for optics in the data center?
Well, as you know, the amount of data center compute resources being brought online every day is enormous, and it just keeps on growing almost exponentially. As we go to next level technologies, as our smartphones get faster, everybody wants their devices to do more. Everybody wants their websites to give them more. Now they're talking about artificial intelligence and that sort of thing.
Right.
If you think about it, like how many times have you deleted apps on your phone because they're using up bandwidth that you don't want to use, or sucking down power, mostly because they're trying to talk to the network. If all of us just started leaving those things running because, I have an unlimited plan now, I'm just going to keep that going, all of that is putting additional pressures on the back end in the data center for more compute, more storage, and more networking, reliable networking to connect that all together.
Yeah, and we always have this issue with infrastructure, which is we're trying to kind of skate to where the puck is going to be, because we have to kind of stagger our refreshes and not be forced into them so quickly. So you mentioned, smartphones. I would guess 5G is potentially an issue.
5G is a big issue. In the networking space, a lot of people are very excited about this. The very lofty goals, they're talking about 100 times the bandwidth going to your phone, 100 times the users being able to access a single cell, and almost more importantly, very, very short latency, like a 5x improvement in latency. This is going to enable a huge number of exciting new applications, VR, AR, all kinds of stuff. And that is going to, once again, drive up the needs on the back end. It's going to create what they call edge computing, where little data centers are moved out to the edge. And some people think that this will decrease the amount that you need on the back end. Actually, it's exactly the opposite. It's going to create all these new applications, which the back end is now going to need to support these edge computing.
Yeah, I think, again, video in general is something that I think it's difficult for us to project what the impact is going to be, but we're not going to want to play catch up there.
Exactly.
I would assume, since you're talking about what's going on in the edge, also IoT, Internet of Things, is a factor here too, because we just have all these, kiosks and meters and devices that we're capturing telemetry from. And I think to some extent we also underestimate the backhaul there.
Oh, for sure. Like all those devices are going to be generating data, are going to be generating bandwidth, and this is going to create huge pressures on the resources inside the hyperscale data centers to scale along with it. And when you think about it, like every app on your phone is kind of its own thing in terms of the Internet of Things. And as we start trusting more of those and bringing more of them online, as it turns out, there's already a lot of devices out there that could be brought online. The actual penetration rate is like maybe about 3% of things that could be brought online as opposed that actually are. You just have to increase the penetration rate from 3 to 9%. Now you've tripled the amount of bandwidth that you need, and data centers today are not prepared to handle that.
Yeah, so tell me about what Interoptic is doing in the optics space in order to kind of help, again, cope with not only what we have going on today, but our need to kind of project out into the future. Where do we put the optics, and what kind of capacity do we need?
Interoptic's been innovating over the years, just like it's always been doing, and even more so now. We're moving more rapidly towards higher data rates to support our customers, looking at new technologies as the industry changes and develops, and supporting our customers in that way. By not being tied to a particular manufacturer or OEM or even technology, we are able to keep our interests aligned exactly with our customers to best support them.
And you can save me some money too.
For sure.
Tell me about that, right? I mean, that's kind of a big part of the value proposition behind brand equivalent.
It is, yeah. Like I was saying, we came into existence so that we could provide an alternative source for these optical networking components so that our customers are not beholden to the OEMs, but a reliable source that they could actually count on. And the savings is quite significant, anywhere from a third to a half the cost of what they're paying for discounted OEM prices.
I think one of the concerns, though, in sourcing optics, though, isn't just sort of the price and quality, but there's this third component, which is my skill sets on the data center management side may not fully encompass some of the complexities when it comes to sort of speccing and implementing optics. Can you just talk to me about what some of those issues might be and how you might help me?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's getting to be more and more choices in terms of these devices.
Mm-hmm.
As we go from 1 gig to 10 gig to 100 gig, it's becoming actually what they call an alphabet soup of different form factors and speeds and kind of subtypes within these groups. We help our customers kind of wade through this sea. We always make sure that they're getting the best value for their dollar. If they don't need this more expensive type, we always direct them towards the cheaper type, so that way they can use the cost savings elsewhere. For security, for example, which is everyone's problem nowadays.
Yeah, so how does optics relate to the security challenge I'm facing?
That's an interesting question. Definitely one of the things we do is we code all of our devices in-house within the US to make sure nothing kind of creeps into them, shall we say. That's
Gotcha.
one of the things we have to do.
Yeah, some issues there. Is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up?
Sure. I'd just like to invite everyone to come by our booth. We're out at 11:13, I believe.
Okay.
And also, for anyone who'd like to share a beverage, we are passing out drinks at happy hour tonight at 5 o'clock.
Great. Robert, thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks, Lenny.
Again, Lenny Liebman from Interop ITX Las Vegas. We'll be back on in a moment with some more interviews, so please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX. I'm Sarah Peters. Our next guest spoke this morning about how identity is changing and the rise of self-sovereign identity infrastructure using blockchain. She is the founder of Identity Woman, Kalia Young. Kalia, thank you for being here and talking about something I love.
Excellent. Yeah, happy to be here.
So a number of different organizations are starting to build identity infrastructures using the blockchain in some way. So let's just start with the question of why is blockchain useful to identity infrastructure?
Great question. So blockchain's useful because it solves a problem we haven't been able to solve without it. I've been working on digital identity and solving it for individuals for 15 years. So we've been looking around and we weren't like blockchain people. Like blockchain was useful for some of its qualities. So the fact that it's a distributed database that's stored around the world and that there's one copy of it, right? Like it's this sort of, it's both centralized and decentralized. Like there's when you update the ledger, each block sort of solidifies what you put in it and it can't be erased and it's maintained forever. So that's a really interesting quality if you don't want information to disappear. And the identity community has been working on innovating a standard called decentralized identifiers. So individuals create their own identifier on their, with software they control, and then they can put it into a distributed ledger, and then they own it forever. This is an alternative to sort of like what we have now, which is you can be in someone else's namespace, like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and you have a username and password. You can rent a URL. You can rent a phone number. But all those types of identifiers, you aren't actually the controller of the identifier. With this new infrastructure, with a decentralized identifier standard, and then using the blockchains to store them, you own it.
And that's what you're talking about when you're talking about self-sovereign. That's different than having a bank give you an identity. This is something where you decide what your identity is, what kind of claims you're going to share about yourself.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah. I mean, you still can use this infrastructure to talk to banks, right? So it's useful in the real world. But you're ultimately the controller of the identifier, which puts you in control in ways that haven't been possible before.
So how is it being used now? What kind of services are out there, and what, how is the individual person putting it to use?
Right. So we're on the cusp of super early adoption, right? Like, I can tell you about pilot projects. But one of the ones that really impressed me was that made me go, okay, this is going to happen, was an application to support individuals logging into their credit union. Right? I was like, oh, it's an app on the phone. It's hidden all the complexity of the decentralized identifiers and the public-private keys. Normal people don't see that stuff. That's all buried in the apps. But it's the infrastructure that makes those apps work in new ways that are innovative, that really center people and put them in control.
I know that there's also blockchain-enabled identity infrastructures being used, for example, by the UN has a project using it to help create people who've been displaced, like refugees, to give them a new digital identity that they can use somewhere where there really isn't an identity infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, it's hard to figure out how real those projects are and what they're really doing. Another piece of it is that, like, you could use the blockchain if you're an institution to issue an identifier to a person, and then that identifier can be read by other institutions the person is interacting with, but they may not ultimately be in control of that identifier, right? So it's more like a portable identifier used across a family of UN institutions. We're not quite, there is no like large-scale public deployment of self-sovereign identity. There's small pilots. There's a pilot in Africa where, under the ICSO Foundation, where they're supporting the disbursement of aid to children who are attending daycare. And so they're keeping the attendance logs using self-sovereign identity, and the parents have identities, and the teachers do. And then the payments get paid out based on the attendance logs that are recorded.
I find it amazing. I kind of love it. But two questions. Why has it been so difficult to create this? Well, no. Why? Not why has it been so difficult to create this before now,
Yeah.
but why is it still difficult at this point? And how much further do we have to go until it becomes this real thing? Because you're saying we're still at the pilot
Yeah, it's
level.
still the
So what do we
pilot
need
stage.
to do before we're all just having self-sovereign identities
Everywhere.
and throwing verified claims around and
Throw
doing our
verified
thing?
claim. Verified claims are really cool because long numbers aren't really interesting. It's like actually what do we know about you, and how do we support that happening? So, the Decentralized Identity Foundation actually was spearheaded by a gentleman at Microsoft. You've got IBM really involved and looking at how they can support this new infrastructure, and selling it to their client base, right? Like they're servicing large institutions all over, and these identity problems, like how do you get identities to people? How do you have digitally native identities to be able to verify? Because right now we're sending faxes and scans of our passports and our driver's license around. So how
It's
do I
not
get a
ideal.
digital version of those things and use them? I think, before the end of the year, you'll see this come into production and actually released to like people. And if you could solve the chicken and egg problem, like if you could get large networks to flip over and turn all the, instead of being under a certain service to be like, oh, now you all have self-sovereign IDs, that
Then
would be
we're
really
there.
cool.
Well, Kalia, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming by. Kalia Young, don't move. We've got more News Desk right here after this.
Thank you.
It's Lenny Liebman of Information Week, and I'm here at Interop ITX in Las Vegas with Paul Anderson, who's VP of Sales North America for Array Networks. Paul, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Lenny. Good to be here.
Let's start off talking about network virtualization, especially as it relates to sort of cloud providers and MSPs, et cetera.
Sure. So, we've seen this move towards virtualization. It's the primary way that the cloud provider and even the MSP now are doing things, right? Very easy as compared to the traditional dedicated networking or security appliance. It's very easy to scale out, scale up. You know, a customer grows, you can scale with them. You get new customers, you can easily add them. You get some customer churn. You can replace one service with another very easily. The other aspect of it is as compared to the dedicated networking appliance, which is a very high cost item, right? The virtual approach allows them to, in a much better way, to map their revenues to the customer demand, or their cost to the customer demand, right? The customer wants a particular service for a particular amount of time, a month, 2 months, 3 months. You can go ahead and pay a networking or security vendor on a subscription basis for some of those services. So you get a customer, you buy that service and you resell it, and it's much more easier to control your costs and to maintain those margins. So all those reasons kind of combine, and this is the direction that a lot of those cloud providers and those MSPs are heading.
Yeah, and that's a good point you have, which is I've got to always be able to map my cost of providing service with what I'm actually billing, so I can have some kind of visibility into what my margins are. But there is a sort of downside with virtualization, which is that if I'm using generic hardware, I may face issues as I'm trying to scale, as my workloads get more intensive, as my customers become more demanding.
Yeah, that's right, and I like to answer this question with a bit of an anecdote, and it kind of comes from some of the real-world observations that we've, in talking to our current customers and also talking to new prospective customers, right? We have customers that 4 or 5 years ago, they would generally buy let's call it a dedicated load balancing appliance or a dedicated application delivery controller appliance, and they're coming to us, in this last year, and we're seeing many of them say, I want to go more of this virtual. I want instead of the traditional physical load balancer, I want a virtual load balancer. And we take a look at it, and what we're seeing is that this is kind of breaking one of two ways. We'll either look at it and we'll say, how many users do you have? How many SSL transactions per second do you have? How much throughput do you need? How complex is the configuration? A couple different things that we look at. And for some customers, we go, you know what, the virtual, this is the right solution for you, actually. And if I'm being totally honest, maybe the big iron appliance, maybe that was a bit overkill for a couple of customers, and we get them into a virtual appliance, and they kind of have the best of both worlds. They get the functionality they want, and it's also very versatile, very adaptable, and they're good. There's another kind of segment of the customers we start talking to, and we look at it, they've got tremendous throughput. They've got a tremendous number of SSL transactions per second. It's complicated, and we kind of go down the list, and what we see is if we're going to try to take the virtualization approach using general purpose servers, we start to see, okay, how many of those do we need? And the truth is that at some point you actually can't throw enough at it to kind of get where you need to go. There's a lot of complexity in trying to get a general purpose server to withstand the demands of networking. And so they look at all those factors and they go, we wanted to go virtual. It may not be the time just yet.
Yeah.
So, and we can, all that stuff you're trying to do, we can get that done with, 2 physical appliances, and you're done and dusted, and you're back in business, and they go, well, let's just do that, right?
Yeah.
So what we're seeing there is there's that trade-off right now. The virtualization approach for networking and security services gives you adaptability, flexibility. And the dedicated hardware appliances gives you simplicity, scalability, performance, and horsepower. And depending on where you're at, you're going to go one direction or the other, right? And so that's what's happening now.
Yeah. So and I think it's interesting that you bring up a point that is, as you add boxes, you've got a variety of complexities that you add to it, which have to do with management, they have to do with licensing the software you're running on it and all that. So maybe you want to talk to me a little bit about how what Array Networks is doing so that maybe I don't have to constantly shift between, okay, here's where I want to be virtual and here's where I want a dedicated appliance.
Sure, so that's exactly right. So Array Networks, we make a product, we call it the Network Functions Platform. And it's a purpose-built platform. So it's purpose-built to run networking and security virtual appliances, right? So as opposed to trying to do virtualization on a general purpose server, we're saying, hey, come take a look at our product. We think this can make a lot more sense. The two things that we really focus in on to try to make our product a better approach is around both performance and complexity. And I think we've touched on that a little bit already. You mentioned complexity, I talked a little bit about performance. And I'll start with the performance, right? So our platform, in contrast to the server, we were actually built from the ground up, purpose-built for the purpose of running virtual networking and security functions, right? So that's, whether that's the components, the chipsets, the Intel, the NICs, whether that's the the advanced hardware acceleration for SSL, all those components are built into those things. They're picked for this particular purpose. And our secret sauce really comes in where we talk about our operating system, right? Because what it allows you to do is all those hardware resources, whether they be the CPUs, the virtual CPUs, the SSL, the hardware SSL resources, memory, interfaces, physical and virtual, we allow you to slice those. You can almost think of it as virtualizing the hardware too. So let's say that I load a virtual network function onto this platform, then I can carve off dedicated hardware resources, tie it to that particular instance, and by doing so, you're going to get hardware-like performance out of a virtual appliance.
So you give me kind of like the modularity of of commodity servers underneath, but I can allocate that as best befits what my needs are for these particular functions. And we were talking about one function in particular I thought was interesting, since you mentioned sort of SSL, kind of this challenge we have with encrypted malicious traffic on a network. You want to talk to me about that function in particular?
I will. I'll make one quick comment on the complexity, and then I'll move very quickly to the SSL solution, because I think it's a good one. The other thing, that in addition to the performance, is there are a lot of things if you're trying to undertake NFV. I'll rattle off a few of them. SRIOV, DPDK, CPU pinning, NUMA boundary, drivers, the list goes on. These are the kinds of things that if you want to get into network functions virtualization, you kind of need to be an expert in some of those things, or you're going to run into trouble. The cool thing about our platform, in my opinion, is that we abstract that. We automate that. So you don't need to be an expert in that. You can simply pick a networking or security virtual function, pick an appropriately sized instance on our box, hit start, and you're off to the races, and don't have to be an expert, right? So it allows you a very quick path to get into this agility of virtualization.
But as I gain expertise, you're going to give me the ability to exercise that expertise so I can fine-tune and configure and get really good at what it is I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We give people, like I say, we have instances that start off on these defaults of entry, small, medium, and large. And it should be kind of obvious from your SKU which one you pick, and you go ahead and start it, and you're going. But if you come back and say, this function is very SSL-centric, and this function is very memory-centric, then as you become more familiar with the box, we allow you to go in there and tweak those knobs, right, and tune it.
Can we go back to the SSL, and can you just real quickly tell me about how you're solving that problem of inspecting encrypted traffic that may potentially be malicious and I got to keep an eye on?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the key solutions that we've seen that's being deployed on this platform is to address the challenge of so much of the traffic on the web these days is SSL encrypted, like 75%, 80%, right? And you got all these great security solutions for doing inspection, DDoS, WAF, IPS, IDS. You can't see the traffic. How do you do the inspection, right? So on our platform, what we do is we bookend the platform with ADCs that can do heavy-duty SSL offload and SSL decryption, and we do a bit of a man-in-the-middle type forward proxy solution. We decrypt it. We service chain it to whatever security services you load on the platform.
Take a look at it. Send it on encrypted.
You got it.
That's beautiful.
Exactly
I like that a lot. Anything else you want to share, because we got to wrap up?
I'll say that if you're interested in some of the things that we've talked about today, I would say swing by our booth. I think we're kind of kitty corner here, but you should be able to find us. We're doing demos. We got a big monitor, and we're kind of walking people through this thing. And we also have a speaking slot in the Interop Theater here at 3:15, where we'll go more in depth in some of the stuff that we talked about here today.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting. Thanks so much, Paul.
Thank you, Lenny. Good to be
Thanks
here.
for joining us. That's Lenny Liebman of Information Week at Interop ITX. If you found this time worthwhile, stay tuned. We got more interviews coming up.
And we are back. It's the Information Week News Desk. I'm Sarah Peters, and this is live coverage of Interop ITX. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, and if you have, say so using the hashtag IWNewsDesk. Our next guest spoke Monday at one of our pre-conference events, the Dark Reading Cybersecurity Crash Course. She spoke about the security issues due to plain old negligence, and it was not plain at all. I can tell you, she was fabulous. Insider threat analyst at DTEX Systems, Katie Burnell. Katie,
Thank you, Sarah.
thank you for stopping by. I
Thank
know
you
that
for
you're
having me.
upset with me calling you fabulous
I'm too fabulous.
because you're just too fabulous and too, what's the word I'm looking for?
Clever?
No, it was humble. That's the word I'm
That's the
looking
word,
for.
yeah.
So during your talk, you talked a bit about both the negligence, security negligence
Yes.
specifically is what we were talking about, of the individuals and also specifically corporate negligence. So can you kind of clarify the difference between those two?
So I think what's key is that negligence ties the user and the company together. You may have a culture in your company that is quite weak in the stance of insider threat. So they're negligent, they're not teaching their users how to be vigilant with what they're doing, and therefore the users have no education or awareness on how to test what they're receiving on email or question what they're seeing on their machines, and then there's just a culture of misunderstanding, which then leads users to doing their own practices, and without any visibility of that, you end up with users being extremely negligent.
One thing that I really took from your talk, which I loved, is that you talk to a lot of people in security and they'll say, you can't fix stupid and users will always make mistakes and therefore user awareness training is completely pointless. But I got from you, yes, users will always make mistakes and therefore user awareness training is essential. Did I get that right?
Yes.
And if so, why is it so essential?
Training your users is essential as a foundation to set the company up for a better standpoint against insider threat. So if you don't educate your users as a company, you have no backbone to fall back on should the biggest breach that you can imagine occur. As a company, you can't say, well, we told you not to do that. And then for argument's sake, the user can say, I wasn't trained. So if you train your users, you're creating a basic line of understanding what should be done, what can't be done, and if that's then reflected at all levels in a company, all the levels up, no matter which department, how senior you are, if you're all following the same understanding of questioning what you receive in general, not just I'm going to test you on phishing, learn how to spot a fish. It's more empowering the employee that anyone could be a victim, anyone could be a target, and teaching them to question what they see and step back and think about what they're doing before they act.
Could that be important when you're in a legal situation, say after a breach and all of these class action suits are coming your way, like if you're Equifax or something?
Yes, something, yeah.
And that helps you have that backbone, like you're saying, not just for
Yes.
security reasons, but for...
Yeah, you need to know and prepare your company for what to do. So if you educate your users, that is the tip of the iceberg. It's an important tip to the iceberg. Your users need to know what to do as an end user receiving something, but also, like you said, legal questions that could occur in an Equifax-style breach. Everyone needs to know the role that they play, and there's been great chats here this week that say that you need a playbook, you need to know what everyone should be doing, and you should exercise this. Don't leave it until the inevitable will happen.
We talk a lot about phishing,
Yes.
but other than that, what things should the people be thinking about when they're coming up with awareness training programs, when they want to know themselves about what further protections that they should put in place to protect themselves from insider mistakes?
I think first and foremost, you need to know what your users are doing. You really need to know what they're doing. You can't think, oh, we imagine our users are just, if they're going to do something bad, they're being malicious. You need to understand that users are negligent in what they do. They're trying their best to be collaborative. They may have teams around the world, and they need to be taught the proper way of sharing information that's secure. They need to be taught which way to upload files online. If they need that for business, there needs to be a corporate understanding of what's been agreed. You need to teach everyone the right way of what they should be doing, rather than enabling users to find their own ways to create PDFs. We see that so much at DTEX with people trying to be useful, and they download a tool and they use it, or they upload to a website that creates a PDF, and that information is completely out of your hands.
In your work, do you find that it's difficult to get that message across to the people at the very top, the ones who might be creating that pressure, saying, well, you got this email, so you must respond to it right away, and you must be working at any time of night, and therefore that's putting the pressure on people to feel like it's okay to do their own thing and not worry about taking that extra step and that extra bit of time that might prevent them
I
from making
completely
some
agree.
bad
So that is, and I touched on that in my presentation, why are we seeing these negligent threats? These users aren't being deliberate in what they're doing. They're trying to do their job, like you said, but there's this pressure from above. Work quickly, work with people all around the world, make sure the information is everywhere it needs to be at one time, and it's a culture that needs to be fostered from the senior levels, that for all that to happen in place, you need to have a basic baseline of good security.
Well, I hope that some of the people here take your wonderful advice. Katie, thank you so much for stopping
Thanks a
by.
lot.
Katie Burnell, stay right where you are, kids, because we have more from Interop ITX after the break. welcome back to the Information Week News Desk. We are live in Las Vegas at the Interop ITX conference at the Mirage. I'm Sarah Peters. Our next guest was one of our keynote speakers this morning and is a big believer that transparency is the lifeblood of a healthy government, and I agree. I am delighted to have the CIO of the city of Detroit, Beth Niblock. Beth.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So let's talk about transparency in government, because it is not an easy thing to accomplish, both on just a theoretical stance, but also on a technological stance. So when you began your work as a CIO in Detroit, how far along were they in that process?
They really weren't very far along. There had been some nonprofits who had come in to help the actual departments of Detroit get data out, but there had not been an executive order that had been issued about open data, and we really didn't have a systematic way to get it out. So Mayor Duggan, who I came to work for, signed an executive order saying all data was open by default, and that we were going to go down this path of transparency because it's the citizens' data, and so they need to be able to find and get the data without having to do freedom of information requests. And we needed to start building trust back with our citizens. And so I felt a strong way to do that was to put the data out there, so we were all working on from the same set of facts. It wasn't something that the government held and people couldn't get hold of. So we worked on doing that.
So then, technologically speaking, then, you have data coming in from a lot of different sources, a lot of different departments. So I imagine we're not all operating from the same place. How were you trying to pull it all together, or just trying to get them working in some way that it was digestible from the user standpoint in a uniform way, or how'd you go about it?
So a couple things. One is we had an open data advisory committee where we had citizens that came on to the advisory committee to help us really prioritize what data sets we should be getting out there. You know, the number one data set was crime. So that was already out there, but we actually, with the guidance of our citizen advisory group and a lot of our neighborhood community groups, we reissued all the crime data and did it in a way that makes it much easier for folks to use. So we went through the data sets, we looked at what our freedom of information requests were, and we tried to start picking data sets by getting the things that were asked for the most.
That makes a lot of sense. Start with what they've already been asking for.
Right.
Along the way, what have been your biggest challenges in making this happen?
So we have some fairly old systems in Detroit that was very hard to get the data out and get it normalized to be able to put on the open data portal. So I think that was a lot of hard work for the team to get it, because you had data fields in open text, and so you really had to do a lot on the data cleanup side. But it was hugely beneficial to us, because in the end, our open data set, our open data portal is where we actually go to pull all of our information back in to do metrics and look at things for departments. So it was to our own benefit to really go down that path.
Got multiple uses for the people and for yourselves.
Absolutely.
I imagine it's not just that you have more data about the city now. There's more machine data that comes in now, with all of the millions of IoT devices out there. And I'm not really sure where Detroit is as far as the smart city place, but it might be going in that direction. So where are you? Are you planning for that?
Yes, so we're reviewing requests for proposals right now on helping us put our smart city strategy together. We have a lot of assets that we have, and we are trying to figure out the best way to use those assets. But central to this is really digital inclusion. It is privacy of the citizens so that our Detroiters know what we're doing with their data. healthcare, mobility, and then a fifth is efficiency of government. So we're in that beginning phase. We do a lot with video. So interestingly enough, a lot of times people who are working on transparency and open data hit a wall at the police department. Our police chief, Chief Craig, was absolutely on it. We're part of the White House Police Data Initiative, and they put everything online. And so that was one of the things. We had been under a federal consent decree, and one of the things that we committed to as we were coming out from the federal consent decree is that we were going to make this data still be available, and we were going to make that crime data easier for people to use.
What has been the response from the public so far?
They really like a lot of the crime viewer. We had a instance where we actually were publishing fire data, and one of our companies who does a lot in civic tech came back and said, we don't think your data's right. You know, we appreciate you putting it out there, but we think there's some problems. And so that actually led us to a process with our civic tech partner of making sure our data was correct, and they were right. It wasn't right. And so they really helped that ecosystem, but it was one that we were able to do through mutual trust.
Well, Beth, I think it's really exciting work there. I know that this is not an easy challenge for the other municipalities that have started it. So thank you so much for stopping by after a keynote session of all things.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Beth Niblock, we are with you here until 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific, at informationweek.com/IW Newsdesk. Stick around. More from Interop after the break. We're ready. Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live at Interop ITX. I'm Sarah Peters. My next guest will be speaking later today on the next wave of reliability engineering. Staff Site Reliability Engineer for LinkedIn, Michael Keogh. Michael, thank you for stopping by.
Thank you, Sarah.
First question, I think, is a pretty obvious one, which is, what is reliability engineering?
So reliability engineering, the way I see it, is helping product and engineering deliver the best possible experience for the end user from an operations perspective. And reliability engineering is basically a specific implementation of DevOps principles, which basically cover breaking down operational silos, accepting failure as something that regularly happens, implementing gradual continuous change, building tools and leveraging that, and then also measuring your systems constantly and creating a feedback loop.
So this is definitely different than your traditional networking engineering, which does not necessarily like the idea of continuous change and responding to it, but which is obviously essential for DevOps.
Yep.
So how do we get that previous role to evolve into a reliability engineer?
Yeah, so over the last couple of years, you've seen a number of vendors sort of, and the open source community move more towards a programmable network. So, 10, 15 years ago, everything was completely CLI based, everything was manually, manual interaction with those devices. And slowly over the past decade, we've sort of seen a lean towards creating programmable networks where switches and routers have APIs, and we have things like the Yang and OpenConfig that are, going through IETF processes and are slowly being adopted by the industry. And as we get to have a more programmable network, we get to enable some of the functionality that we get, or some of the opportunities we get out of the reliability space, where we can now apply configuration and test our configuration in a controlled manner before deploying it out in the wild. And we can do that quickly. We can roll back quickly to minimize risk or outages. And the other thing we've also gotten out of this evolution of the switch or router technology is also better telemetry. So, people are still using SNMP, which is a very old protocol, and it's done its job. But we've sort of moved on to the next level of maturity, where we're getting streaming telemetry, and we can get feedback into what's happening within our network with much tighter feedback loops. And so, having that continuous delivery, having operability and measurability of the network allows us to go towards the reliability approach towards network engineering.
So it allows you to be a lot more nimble in a whole lot of different ways from what you're telling me.
For sure. So one of the things I'll actually be talking about this afternoon is basically, with a lot of this change, engineers have much greater agility. So they can, instead of being bogged down in operations work like deployment, in manually deploying things on number of switches, one by one, there are systems that can do that. And so instead of the engineer sort of copy-pasting configuration, they can build it, they can get it verified, they can test it, and then another system deploys it, which lets them get on with their day-to-day job instead of just moving that configuration around the network.
So obviously you're doing this at LinkedIn. What kind of a team do you have? How did you go about building it? What are your people like?
So at LinkedIn, for our reliability side, we're basically taking a traditional sysadmin role and looking for people with coding abilities, understanding of how software architectures work, and also who have a little bit of coding skills, and we put that together into the reliability role. So it's a very multifaceted skill role. For network engineering, we are continuously looking towards people who have more coding ability, who can start to build those platforms that enable our network to be more programmable and to build better monitoring systems on our network so we can deliver the best possible user experience for the member.
Now, have you, as you're talking to other organizations out there, do any of them tell you, oh, we couldn't possibly do this? And if so, are there any reasons that they might be skittish about moving away from the traditional way of doing things over to this manner?
So I think reliability engineering is it's a large cultural change, but if you sort of break it down further, it's just an evolution of the sysadmin role. So 10, 15 years ago, sysadmins were doing a lot of the work that what SREs are doing now, but we've sort of pulled in a few more skills and solidified what that job title actually looks like. So for reliability engineering, there's a lot of very open forums. We just had SRECon US, and so we heard a lot about what our peers are doing, and we've heard a lot about how to build teams, how to find those people, which it can be difficult. But we found the industry to be very, very open, and a lot of ideas are exchanged regularly between different companies.
Now, it's interesting to me because it sounds like you're training really kind of creating a new workforce and a new role out of people who were not necessarily being groomed into this role, not necessarily out of a traditional engineering career. Am I understanding that correctly?
So I think building off that, SRE is very much about continuous learning. One of the goals I have when I go to work every day is to sort of learn something new. As a network engineer, as a sysadmin, as a software engineer, you never know anything, and generally, the more you know, you realize the less you know.
Yeah, I understand that.
But so, in building this workforce and building our team, we realize that not everyone knows everything, but a lot of the role is also going back to the original DevOps principles, is breaking down operational silos. So if you don't have the answer, you should know someone who does have the answer, and that's how you become an effective site reliability engineer.
Well, you've taught me a lot, Michael, and I'm delighted that you stopped by. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Michael Keogh. Stick around. More News Desk after this. And we're back. It's the Information Week News Desk. We are at Interop, and I'm Sarah Peters. My next guest is speaking tomorrow on developing talent versus hiring expertise. She is founder of Women in Linux, Tamika Reed. Tamika, thank you for stopping by.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. First question, we come across this problem in IT in particular aspects of IT,
Correct.
where we have skills shortages.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a problem of us just not having enough people who are interested in the field, or is it a problem of us just not presenting our fields in a way that that interests enough people?
I think it's a twofold answer, right?
Okay.
I think is the presentation of how the information is being presented to our target audience. We're pushing, hey, let's code, when like that's the only way to get in tech, when it's not. I started out with doing Cisco networking. There is still security. There's still other avenues of tech that we just don't talk about, and that's not presented. Like when was the last time you heard someone push someone being a distributed computer or a high performance computing admin or into networking? That's just something that's not talked about, but that's an opportunity there. That's so from the college level all the way up to the DOJ, all the way up to DOD. That's an opportunity. We just don't never talk about it. And as far as how people are receiving that information, well, that information is not even being put out there, so they're most definitely not receiving it. But the other aspect of that is we're also not presenting the information at a lower level. And when I say a lower level, at a community college level, even at a high school level, like we're pushing, hey, go to college, but then when you get out, you're in debt. Or if you go to a boot camp, you're in debt, right? So how do we combat that ongoing problem? So it's a twofold issue. It's at an educational level in terms of high school and colleges, but it's also at a level of where we're pushing our talent, away. Most cities can't keep their own talent. Houston is one. Shout out to Blacks in Technologies, but Houston is one of them. Another one is area that I hold dear is Atlanta. I like one of their initiatives that they did with some of the community colleges combined with the insurance companies. And what they're doing is they're building the community colleges into, I guess you could say they're learning big data. And so there's been a big push of that, So like, what if I don't want to go to a 4-year college? Or what if I can't afford a 4-year college? But I go to a 2-year college and I want to learn tech, but when I get out, I can't go get a job. So we have to change
what we're asking for.
What we're asking for,
place.
and change what we're presenting.
That kind of seems to start from. It starts from the very beginning, but even when a person is applying for a job, for example, in security, they'll be asking for somebody with a certification, and that requires 5 years of experience before a person even has 5 years of experience.
Right.
So they're asking for things that are kind of impossible in the first place. And as you're saying also, they seem to be looking for people only from a very, very small segment, as opposed to opening up to community colleges and opening up to people who aren't coming right out of MIT.
Right.
So how do we change that?
So we change that so what I do in Women in Linux is I try to give you a 360 view of tech.
Okay.
So in that 360 view, it may be, hey, this is the route for security. Like right now, a lot of people are security engineers, but in the fact that they're security engineers, they are just learning like how to push paper. They're not really learning the technical side. So a lot of people who are in that field are getting pushed out because now they need technical people. So how do they get their skills? Education and retraining at the jobs. The $5,000 doesn't work anymore.
Right. No. Well, the problem of training, I think, comes up a lot too, right? Because they want you to come in with these skills already, but I talk to organizations that will not train their
Exactly.
employees because they're afraid that they're going to go to somebody else
Right.
who treats them better, like
Right.
they're an abusive boyfriend or
It's
something.
it's a tunnel vision, right? It is an abusive relationship, right? You know, I'm a feed you just enough so you don't die,
Right.
right? I mean, that's really what it is, right?
Yeah.
You know, but at that same token, you have to be, you know, aware of that. I am getting abused,
Mhm.
right? You know, and step outside of your lane.
Lastly, I know that diversity initiatives are important to you and
Mhm.
should be important to all of us. And it seems like so many of them are cursory
Mhm.
and kind of a joke and
Mhm.
aren't really even pushing the needle in a lot of places. What have you seen that is working
Mhm.
and what just isn't working?
What I know works is how you present information. So attending meetups is one thing, but what if your meetups are recorded? What if people can attend them virtually? San Francisco OpenStack has one of the biggest meetups. They record their meetups. You can go back and watch them online. You can attend them virtually. You can ask questions live. That's important because if I have a student who's sitting in Zimbabwe, which we do have students that sit in Africa, and they can't attend a meetup that's sitting in New York, but they want that information, right? How do they get that information? Do they have to study on their own and be the champion? No. The whole point of having a community is to build a community so you have resources, right? So I believe in having things that are recorded. I think more conferences should do live streams. I think we should get out the information more if we want to see diverse talent. You can't do something one way and then expect it to be diverse. Right?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Improving access to this information
Right.
is a big first step.
Right.
Thank you so much for stopping
problem.
by. It has been a pleasure. Tamika Reed, don't you move, because there's more News Desk right after this. Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX. My next guest is one of my favorite people. She was one of our security track chairs, and she is also speaking later today herself on navigating key challenges across IT and InfoSec silos. SVP of Global Security Solutions for Fortress Information Security, Jules Okafor. Jules, thank you so much for stopping by.
Hello, how are you, Sarah? Good to see you again.
I am hanging in there. We still have hours to go of News Desk.
Oh
but
my gosh, you do a great
cruising.
job.
Well, thank you. As are you always.
Thanks.
As I mentioned, you are speaking today about the trying to break down the silos between IT and information security. So specifically, where do you see the biggest communication breakdowns? Who is not speaking to each other, and what are they not speaking about?
Got it. So inside of organizations, what I find all the time is the people who should be speaking aren't. So for instance, management isn't speaking in clear language to security operations. The CIOs, the CISOs, they're not talking enough. And then more than that, the security teams are divided into physically divided areas and then also functional divided areas. However, they all have the joint mission to protect the organization and keep it running. And so those people who need to communicate across those silos aren't, because more than likely they're divided into different areas, and they're being told that they only need to focus on the one thing.
So it's a problem that's being reinforced
Yes.
by, well, how do we fix that then?
So what's happened is that the nature of threats have changed, and therefore one would think the businesses would change to adapt. But businesses are holding on to the traditional way, and the way they've been set up. And so for years, everyone thought security meant keeping everything apart. If you were able to isolate systems, if you were able to keep people off of systems, you were able to protect it. What we're finding now is the lack of visibility into those areas by the people who need to access the data prevents, it allows hackers in, but it also prevents the people who could protect it from having the requisite data to make the right decisions. So it's become a really big problem across organizations.
I know that we've spoken before about visibility, specifically as it relates to industrial control systems, since they're running much older technology that our cybersecurity systems doesn't even work on some of those things. And the other problem is the operation technicians, the OT side and the IT side, really speak completely different languages. So talk a little bit more about that.
So with regard to ICS, what we at Fortress, we tend to find cultural challenges. So OT operators have typically been in their roles for years, maybe 20, 30 years. They've worked on one system, they've built a system, they've programmed it, they know that system really well. But typically, that system doesn't keep up with modern technology. And so security becomes bolted on. So back in the day, the OT was kept in the facilities, and then you had the central offices where IT was. IT, right out of school, they're learning new trends, new technologies. They want to go in and they want to secure the old systems. But those two teams have separate functions. OT, they want to keep the system up and running. IT, they want to secure it. They don't play well together. And typically, there's not a lot of communication about how IT can learn from OT about what the systems are and what benefits they bring to the business and why it's important to keep them running. And OT can typically benefit from talking to IT about new and modern ways to perhaps monitor data, ways in which you can actually collaborate around centralizing and storing data, and then providing network segmentation that keeps the system safe, but the data available to those who need to use it.
Well, since we're talking to a lot of IT people right now, what few lessons would you tell them to learn from their OT people?
So I would say, one, walk into the situation with respect. Don't assume you know. What I find more than anything is OT people say, if IT people would just listen. So I've set up lunches where IT and OT people work together, and a lot of it is just reach out and ask somebody to go to lunch, start a meal, start a conversation. The second thing I would suggest is do your research. There's a lot of more information about OT systems online. There are conferences specific to ICS and IT and OT systems. do your research, and then ask more questions. You ask better questions, and people are more willing to work with you. And then I would say finally, the idea is collaborate. Make it more of a partnership than a fighting match. Make it more about how you can help versus how you can stop whatever's happening already. And I think typically more and more IT people are going in that direction, but it's going to take a long time for people who've been doing the same job and managing the same systems over time to let them in. So just keep trying. I think that would be my advice.
It does seem that some IT people don't really understand the challenges of operation technology, and they just think, well, it just works the same.
That's exactly it.
And it doesn't matter if putting a patch on.
That's exactly.
breaks
Maintenance
for a while.
windows, for OT systems are like, very, very as short as possible, and they're not very frequent. So
Right.
you have to figure out how to work within that. Where IT, they typically have more frequent maintenance windows, and they tend to be longer. If a system goes down, it doesn't kill the entire company. However, if a production system goes down, a company could lose millions of dollars of revenue. So it's a really different way to look at your job on both sides. Yeah.
Now, going back out of ICS for a bit,
Okay.
would you recommend the same kinds of things, taking everybody to lunch, or what other recommendations do you have for breaking down silos between IT departments?
So between IT and InfoSec, I think it's more about cross collaboration on projects. So project teams that include an IT person, InfoSec person, at the beginning of the project. Typically the problem is InfoSec will go down a path, IT will go down a path, they're different paths, and they don't talk until a decision's been made, and then they tell the other side. I typically suggest bring all the right stakeholders to the table up front so that InfoSec can have their say, IT can have their say, and then you build a project sort of incorporating all the things that are important. And at the end of it, during the project, you have milestones where you keep up with each other and you say, where are we with this? Are we still meeting our expectations? And then at the end, you have a wrap up. The more you do that, the more it encourages communication, and you get to understand each other's needs, wants, and interests.
Are you hopeful? Are you seeing movement in that, or are people still resistant?
So the collaboration piece is still pretty immature. I would say we're solving for problems 2009, 2010. So technology has been really helpful in helping to bridge the collaboration, but the conversations are not happening as much as they probably should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Jules, thank you so much for stopping by. It's
Thank
always
you.
a pleasure to talk to you. Jules Okafor,
Thank you.
the news desk, is going to take a little break so Lenny and I can recharge. We'll be back online at about 2:05 unless it takes the production team a little bit longer to find a free wall socket to plug Lenny and me into. Otherwise, we'll be back soon. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's Lenny Liebman of Information Week, and I'm here again at Interop ITX at Las Vegas with Andrew Davis, who is Director of Marketing and PR for DisplayLink. Hey, Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good, Lenny. It's great to be here this week.
I'm glad to be speaking with you, especially because I think a lot of people kind of have this vision of the future workplace with a lot of devices, you know, and BYOD and all that, as being sort of this just pervasive Wi-Fi is the way we're solving the access problem. You have a different point of view, and I'd like you to share it.
So, you know, Wi-Fi is great, but it's like a little bit like the utopian future. One of the things that we face all of the time is that people are looking at how do they segment who's on a Wi-Fi network and who's not on a Wi-Fi network. So in actual fact, when you're at desk, you know, you're going to get really great connectivity still through a wire. And if you connect through a wire and you're freeing up the wireless network for everyone that really needs to be wireless that's walking around, it just makes the whole environment a little bit easier to use.
Yeah.
You know, so we've brought a lot of devices into the market which solve that problem at a desk level.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. Also, I mean, Wi-Fi is a zero-sum game, so the more consumers we have, right, the less bandwidth we have.
Exactly.
And also there's some particular applications we're doing in terms of sort of either hot desking or changing workspaces. So just tell me a little bit about how you see that working out in the future in our businesses.
So hot desking is the big buzz button right now. Everybody wants to move to that environment. They're rolling out new offices or new infrastructures, and it poses a lot of problems. You know, we've got a lot of people who you've got, you know, what kind of connector is it on your notebook? How old is your notebook? And IT can't afford to change everything overnight. You know, no one has those budgets. So what we've done is we've enabled devices to simply connect over USB. And it doesn't matter whether it's the latest and greatest USB Type-C with power delivery or the really old, you know, Generation 1 USB-A connectors. And we've built little devices like this one that I've got in front of me here. This is a USB universal docking solution. This particular one's from Targus, but we work with HP, Dell, Lenovo, all the big guys. And what you do with this from a hot desk environment is literally just plug in one cable. So IT can set up a desk, multi-4K setup, plug in, have one cable sitting on the table, and then when somebody walks up with, you know, an Apple computer, a Linux computer, Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, whatever it is, you just plug in that one cable, it's just going to work. And that simplifies the whole rollout infrastructure decision process.
And this is also useful for us because certainly the opportunities are in USB are changing with Thunderbolt, et cetera, those technologies. Maybe you want to talk about a little bit what's going on at the USB level with our mobile technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, USB is the one technology that it's there for the long haul. You know, we've had it on every single device in the world, so that's one thing we can actually rest assured, touch wood, it's not going to change too far in the future either. Thunderbolt, you know, came as a new technology. It's on some of those latest notebooks. But the problem is, you know, if you go to work one day, you might be cycling to work, or, you know, you're in a coffee shop and you tip a coffee over your notebook, and you go to IT and say, can I replace that? You're probably not going to get that same latest and greatest notebook. And then when you get a new one, or an old one in that environment, how do you connect to your desk? So that can actually bring some real problems. So we've actually skirted around a lot of that. We've gone with just pure USB, simplify it right down, but we haven't taken away the scalability. So Thunderbolt has this huge bandwidth, 40 gigabits per second.
Right.
But if you divide it out and work out 4K, that's going to give you about 38 gig per second anyway, you know, or 36, something like that. So the reality is you've kind of run out of all of your bandwidth anyway.
Right.
With DisplayLink solution, we scale. So we'll take that bandwidth and we'll dynamically adjust as we need to. So we've actually got one demo on the booth there where we're showing 4 of these connected back to back, like daisy chain between each one. And that's giving us 8 4K displays, still over a single connector.
Right.
So the beauty of that is, you know, for those users who say, I want more than 2, okay, I want 4. Now 4 4K displays, that's the equivalent of 8K pixels. That's a lot of pixels.
Right.
We can compress that dynamically in a way that users will never even see, will never even notice, and it's just going to work.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's interesting in light of what's going on in the actual sort of economics of employment with gig economy and more of us sort of bringing contractors in who are doing work for a certain period of time. The whole IT provisioning cycle really doesn't work. And, and even from a physical point of view, let alone all the access and permission.
Correct. I mean, BYOD, you know, bring your own device, you walk into the device, you don't know what people are going to bring. So the beauty of it is it's just USB. It exists on every single device in the world. There's nothing to worry about. So the latest and greatest docking stations that deploy DisplayLink technology, they have that Type A and Type C connector. So it really doesn't matter. You just plug in the right cable and you're good to go.
Yeah, well, we have other things to do besides futz around with these connectors anyway.
You don't want to waste time on that.
Yeah. Let's pivot completely because I also see you have a VR headset, and I'm going to ask you about it for a second about sort of wireless VR. But maybe you want to tell me first why I should care. What are the business use cases that you see emerging in terms of VR in the enterprise?
Right, no problem at all. I mean, it's kind of exciting and also a little bit strange to see VR in an IT show. A lot of people use VR for gaming and things like that. But the future of VR, we see it moving in a wholly different direction. We've had a lot of people contact us from like the automotive industry, and they want to do design reviews. So they want to actually put a headset on, be immersed, and see a product that they can't yet, they haven't built a real product. It's just virtualized. Automotive industry is a great one, but switch gears and look at things like airplane. So we had an airplane company contact us recently at the show, and they said they want to stand inside an airplane before it's built, adjust the seat pitch, and stand and feel what does it feel like to walk down the corridor and the aisle, adjusting the seat pitch to feel the environment before they've even spent the money and built the plane. So the enterprise environment usage cases for VR are really coming thick and fast. And it really is kind of, you can imagine it, that's where this technology is going to go. The problem, however, is no one wants a cable.
Yeah. And I do think it's interesting for us to, again, think about sort of CAD-CAM generally sort of starting to become a VR experience. But yes, cable is certainly an impediment. So why don't you talk a little bit about, maybe you even want to hold that up and show the entire network.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I've got here this is actually the Vive 1 headset.
Okay.
But we're not limited to the Vive 1. We've chose HTC just because they were the leader in the market on this one. We just showcased this actually with the Vive Pro, which is 78% more pixels, so higher resolution. We've got an adapter on the back here. This adapter has actually got two antennas, left and right, you can see here. And there's actually a battery compartment. So if I open this guy up, we drop a battery inside here, and that powers everything that you need for the wireless antenna, as well as all of the headset itself. And that battery is going to give you about 3 hours life. So the beauty of that is that as you are using VR and you've got the battery, it's powering the headset, you're running around, these antennas are picking up the signal. All of the data for the video, all of the data for the audio is all transmitting to here. So that 3 hours of life is really, really critical to be able to get.
What's the bandwidth though, or is there more than just a lot of bandwidth that allows you to kind of provide a wireless VR experience?
Great question. So we're actually running at a 60 gigahertz regime. So 60 gigahertz is a beautiful spectrum because you're not going to see any interference. There's people who've looked at things like Wi-Fi, 5 gigahertz, but the problem is in that channel, it's like we started out earlier on,
zero-sum.
Exactly, zero-sum game. 60 gigahertz is a great channel because no one else is going to be there. You're not going to run into anything. Now 60 gigahertz also won't go through your hand, won't go through a piece of paper. So the beauty is if you want to divide out environments, you can localize from a security perspective very, very easily. It also gives us the ability to have multiple channels that can work simultaneously. So we can have multiple users in the environment interacting with one another. Now, the problem we still come down to, of course, is bandwidth is not a given.
Right.
So as you run around and you're transferring between these antennas, you're still seeing bandwidth move. Now, we're not streaming video. This isn't Netflix. This is an environment where, as you move around,
it's got to be real time.
It's got to be real time. So we had to get the latency down to pretty much zero.
Right.
And this is what we're showing here at the booth, and we think that that's changing the environment for enterprise to now start to engage in wholly different ways. But it's not just for enterprise. Education, there's a lot of education people here at Interop. When we went to school, geography was we opened a book, and that was as close as we got. Now you get a little bit of video.
Go ahead to Madagascar in a virtual reality.
Exactly.
And is there anything, is the invitation to kind of come by the booth and check it out? I know some people don't think they're doing VR yet, but just to kind of get ahead maybe of the curve that might be coming this way, what's your call to action here?
So the real call is, we're showing this for the first time at the booth. Everybody that's come up has been pretty much mind blown so far. But the call to action, come by, try it out. We've got a bunch of different experiences and we'd love to show people.
Great. Well, I'll definitely going to take you up on the invitation myself, Andrew. It's good to talk to you.
Terrific. Likewise. Thanks very much, Lenny.
Sure. Lenny Liebman of Information Week here at Interop ITX in Las Vegas. Please stay tuned. We got a lot more great interviews coming up. Thanks. Lenny Liebman of Information Week, and I'm here at Interop ITX in Las Vegas, and I'm with Zach Turner, who's sales engineer with Mimecast. Zach, it's good to see you again.
Hey, good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Listen, the first thing, let's just talk about sort of email as a threat vector, and maybe not just email itself in terms of the way an exploit is initiated, but then what happens afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, there's the standard practices out there, right, among the email front. You're looking at malicious attachments. 60% of those of malware installed on machines are coming from email attachments. Malicious URLs are a common threat as well. The landscape is starting to change, so we're starting to see more of the social engineering, the spear phishing, whaling type of attacks. So 90% of attacks always start with a phish.
Yeah.
So some type of, hey, I'm going to send this email, try to get some kind of information back.
Yeah. And then once that happens, that provides a launching pad for a more extended, sophisticated infiltration.
Absolutely. If it's malware, if it's a bad URL, even if it's wire transfer with an attached document saying this is how you transfer this money to this account.
Or credential grab or whatever.
Yep.
And to some extent, especially when you talk about sort of social engineering, a big part of our vulnerability is the behavior, perception, and digital hygiene of our many end users whose job is not security.
Right, yeah, and that's your last line of defense.
Right.
You're literally hoping, you're trusting your entire business off of your end users' backs.
Yeah.
So you just have to assume that they may not know what they're doing, and we want to protect it at all costs.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of, I mean, you have a broader value prop, but part of it is understanding what's going on with the behavior of end users. So go ahead, tell me how Mimecast is kind of addressing this issue of, inadvertent bad behavior by our own people.
Yeah, great example at Mimecast is going to be URL clicks. Right. So any URLs that are coming in through emails, we want to make sure that we're logging and reporting what URLs those end users are clicking. We can also bring in a campaign type, a challenge to that end user. So if they're prompted with the page, we can say, hey, do you think this end site is safe or malicious? This is the actual URL you're trying to go to. And then giving it into the end user's hands for them to make the decision. And then based off of that, we can then build out a reporting tool saying, all right, this is our list of good users, this is our list of bad users that need a little more education.
And that education is a pretty important piece, right? We want to be very directed in that. We don't want to put, I think, people through bad training for two reasons. One, it wastes their time, but the other thing is the more you train somebody on something they feel they already know, the more they ignore anything you tell them in the future, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so you're providing some kind of reporting and challenging that lets me progressively over time, or maybe as part of the onboarding of the employee do that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a manual policy that we can trigger and kind of set up maybe a percentage of clicks of URLs. There's also machine learning built into it, so we can see the software will actually learn if that user's a bad user, then they're going to be prompted with that challenge page more often. Yeah. If it's a good user, they'll be prompted less, right? So we want to encourage good behavior, discourage bad.
Yeah. But that's just one facet of the overall service. Maybe you want to just, so everybody understands, what does Mimecast do overall with email?
So Mimecast is a pure cloud system. It's built off the Mime OS.
Okay.
It underpins all products and services to ensure functionality within the actual service as a cloud that Mimecast offers in email security. We also bring in the end user awareness piece that we talked about. Another really neat feature that Mimecast offers is business continuity.
Okay.
So if your Exchange server's down, if Office 365 is down, we're offering that 100% uptime SLA.
So I think that's really important because a lot of the discussions, especially, I was just at a security show, right, a couple weeks ago, and people here looking for security, we tend to silo that, right? Like security is about prevention and, stopping anything malicious in our environment before it gets to the crown jewels, et cetera. But continuity is an essential part of defending the business from a revenue and operations point of view.
Absolutely, 100%. Email is used 91% of the time in businesses, right? It's the app, it's the killer app,
right?
In the world today. If that's down, your business suffers. There's no going back. You're waiting on Office 365 to come out with a patch. You're waiting on your Exchange admins to come out with a fix, whatever it is. So rather than being hours down and being detrimental to your business, you're maybe a couple minutes down setting up that continuity event within Mimecast.
Yeah, really important, again, as part of the overall equation of protecting the business. I do think, though, that one of the concerns that anybody who's kind of running applications and networks in today's enterprise is I can't really acquire, manage, get up to speed on, maintain relationships with like 28 different vendors with 28 point solutions. So can you help me understand how I could incorporate your solution in my environment without creating like additional complexity, which is really one of my biggest problems right now?
Vendor consolidation is a big project plan or pain point for a lot of businesses out there, right? So Mimecast, through our Mime OS, we're offering a lot of the products and features that other vendors are trying to maybe patchwork together, right? So the consolidation piece plays into there as well.
Can you give me some specifics about kind of what's all in the box, what's all in the package?
Yeah,
Just a
so
little
we're not only looking at email security, right? We're also looking at the continuity feature. We want to secure the environment if it's down. We're also looking at archiving. So for companies out there that are GDPR compliant and need that type of compliance within their archiving system, Mimecast can help you out there. And then the reporting tools and pieces. We work with different SIMs out there. We have a direct plugin with Splunk, Logarithm. We have our Open API framework, so we can develop those Open API calls to gather a lot of that data that Mimecast is collecting, bring it into your SIM tool, and then perform some type of smart response.
Yeah, I think it's really important, again, to gather the information. I think it's not only important for security, but also for compliance, right? I not only have to protect my data, but like with GDPR, I also have to be able to prove to either an internal or external auditor that I've done that successfully.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share that if somebody's at the show right now, for example, and they're interested in what you're doing, anything you want to offer them to do?
Stop by booth 706. We'd happy to show you a demo, get on a phone call with you. But I appreciate the time with you. Great talking with you.
Glad to talk to you about it. A really important issue. Okay, that's been Zach Turner, who's sales engineer at Mimecast. I'm Lenny Liebman of Information Week. We're here at Interop ITX in Las Vegas. Please stay tuned. We got another great interview right behind this one.
Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX in sunny Las Vegas. We're streaming live at informationweek.com/IW Newsdesk until 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific. I'm Sarah Peters. My next guest spoke today about hybrid cloud success and failure, and I have a pretty good guess which there have been more of, successes or failures. Managing Director and Analyst of Evaluator Group, Camberly Bates. Camberly, thank you for stopping by.
Thank you, Sarah.
We talk a lot about this move to the cloud from on-prem systems, but a lot of times people say they want to make that move, but when it really comes down to it, they say, well, we're going to stay on-prem. So with the people that you speak to, what's your feeling? How long are people going to be really on-premise?
In my lifetime, forever, for the rest of my life. You have to look at it by a use case, about what they're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the numbers, off-prem or public cloud is actually, from a cost standpoint, can be more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But the drive to go up there is what we call agility. It's how fast I can move. So there's a huge value when you think about time to market. If I'm pushing to get something done, maybe I'm going to be doing it up in the cloud because it's going to take me too long to get things done on-prem. But I don't see premises, the stuff that's on premises, disappearing. There's too many use cases for why we want it on premise, and that's everything from compliance to security to how systems actually work, on the factory floor or something.
Mm-hmm. So are there certain industries that you think it's going to be, they're going to take a longer time to make that cloud maneuver, that cloud move?
I think every industry, the most likely industries are the ones that are born in the cloud, they're going to stay in the cloud, et cetera. And then you go down and you look at things, and I think one of the examples I've given is looking at the mining industry. A mining operations is in the middle of nowhere, and if the line drops, communication line drops to the cloud, guess what? I'm stopped. My business is stopped. So there's quite a few industries that are like that, where on premise, you think of a store, a retail store. On premise, if you stop being able to take credit cards, you're done.
You're out of luck.
You're done. You're not going to be processing. So almost every industry has got those kind of use cases, and those use cases then end up staying on premise. And then there's other use cases that say I can leverage the flexibility, the agility, or maybe the cost basis of some of the cost basis like Glacier, Amazon Glacier or something like that, and moving data to the cloud.
As you're saying a use case and trying to have that agility, of course my mind immediately goes to DevOps. Are there times though where there's where it makes sense to start in the cloud and then move back on-prem? Is that another reason for having that hybrid approach?
Yes. One of the use case that I like to talk about right now is having to do with the buzz around artificial intelligence, right? And developing or doing your initial work up in the cloud is probably extremely effective because I've got a huge amount of processing power. I've got the latest in technologies like GPUs that I'm going to do that are very costly and sometimes hard to get a hold of. And I can dynamically build lots of different environments. And when you're doing artificial intelligence, you're having to train your data. It's kind of like training a kid. So you're training your data, or you're training your systems to think correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Once those systems get to the point that they're stable, then from a production standpoint, I'm probably going to move it on-prem because my costs will be less to be on-premise, sometimes a third less or a half, 50% less cost to be on-premise, and I'm in a stable environment. And then maybe I go on to the next deal and do the same thing all over again up in the cloud. But that's a kind of a classic situation, not classic because that's brand new technology that we're using right now, but that is some of the things that we advise our clients and say, hey, this is probably a good idea.
Got it. Now, since the name of your session is Successes and Failures, how do you see people, what are the main mistakes that you see people making that causes a hybrid cloud to ultimately fail?
Not defining exactly what they're trying to do. So the initial systems that were implemented starting maybe 5 years ago were being done because they want to provide cloud as a service on premise. And those actions didn't have a strong use case to say this is how we want to architect and design for.
Great. Well, Kimberly, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I know that it's that this is something I really want to learn more about, because every person that I talk to, especially in the security world, is struggling with governing their hybrid cloud, and just the very phrase hybrid cloud makes them a little skittish. So thank you for sharing your knowledge, and it's been a pleasure having you here.
You're welcome.
Kimberly Bates, stay with us here. And please don't forget that hashtag IW News Desk. We will be right back at the news desk after the break.
me is Eddie Kwong, who's sales engineer with Raritan. Eddie, it's good to see you.
Thanks, Lenny. Thanks for having me.
Sure, I also have to add Jersey, represent.
We know how it is.
So the first thing I just want to talk to you about is kind of, there's so much with sort of virtualization and software as a service and cloud that sometimes I think we lose sight of the importance of kind of underlying physical infrastructure, both in the data center and also increasingly in remote offices that are depending on hardware to get the services they need to operate.
I think it's an important point to remember that whether you're using software as a service or whether you're hosting those services yourself, these things have to sit on hardware somewhere. There have to be physical servers. They have to sit in a rack. And those racks need to be powered, and they need to consider security, right, and environmental monitoring. And there are a lot of factors that you don't think about because everything is a service or becoming that way. But there is a real physical footprint that needs to be maintained.
And do you see, for example, in the data center that data center operators are increasingly interested in doing security, et cetera, at the rack level?
So security is a big one. We are also seeing a tremendous move towards high density. Data center real estate is expensive, and you want to put as much compute power into a single rack as possible. So whereas traditionally we're talking about 10 kW per rack, now they're asking for power delivery of, I've had people ask me for 64 kW per rack.
Right.
So we're definitely seeing moves in that direction. As far as security goes, definitely a focus on security. All these devices in the rack could be potential jumping off points for someone to do something malicious. So you want to have all those practices in place, protocols in place to make sure that you have a secure environment.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people know Raritan kind of as KVM or serial over IP, but you're talking in terms of power. You're really thinking about doing a lot of this with the PDU as a platform.
That's correct. That's correct. So we got into the PDU business as an accessory to KVM. This is many, many years ago.
Right.
We've been in the intelligent PDU space for a little over 10 years now, I believe, and we got really, really good at it, right? One of our strengths, one of our core competencies was we can make custom units. We can build them to your requirement, and that includes mechanical considerations, but also capabilities and security. And so we have a very robust engineered to order program, and that's how we are able to help our customers get exactly what they need.
Yeah, and on the sort of remote office side, again, where we don't have IT people in place, this is particularly important for not just management, but also implementation. Maybe you want to talk to me a little bit about that.
So we see our controller as a platform, right? Your typical view of a PDU is it delivers power in the rack, and maybe I'll be happy if it gives me monitoring, tell me that I'm over current, right? But we have a very powerful controller. We've always designed our controller to be more than just a simple device to control PDU. And so what we've done is we've made it basically the foundation of the smart rack. It can handle many different types of sensors, environmental sensors, temperature, humidity. We can control the door locks, lock so that you can issue electronic commands to unlock the door. We could support RFID card readers. We can plug a camera, webcam, and tell the PDU, snap a picture of the guy that swiped his card, so we could verify that this is the person that has the authorization to get to that rack.
Yep. And I think, by the way, that's increasingly important because we used to, going back to the data center, have this idea that, well, as long as you have to swipe a card to get into it, it's okay. But increasingly, with some of the compliance requirements we have, we really have to be able to document the fact that we've only let the right person with the right authorization touch that server based on a need to touch the server.
That's correct, and that's the kind of capability we've put into our solution. So we're not talking about the PDU can do this, we're talking about the comprehensive solution, the software, the sensors, the monitoring tools in the rack.
So I guess one challenge, though, we have is as much as you can sort of make a case that I want to be able to call up the fact that I saw Eddie's face at the rack, Tuesday, July, whatever, and that he was the one who touched this particular device at a particular time. We have a lot of other pressures on our infrastructure in terms of whether it's wireless, security, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of us may feel like, okay, well, my PDU isn't broke, so why fix it? Maybe you want to help me understand, how do we bubble up or prioritize the decision to modernize this physical management of infrastructure?
Well, so the value add here is the smarter your rack, the more visibility you have into what's going on to your data center. I'll give you an example, right? You have an alert on a breaker that trips in your rack, right? You can't do anything about that with a traditional basic PDU, right? There's no action you can take. You can't turn off. You can't check on your equipment. You can't get remote access to them. And you might be at home. This might be happening at 2 a.m. in the morning. So that's a drive, potentially hour-long drive to the office, to the lab, to address the situation. If you get the live alerts, right, and if you're able to do, let's say, issue an automatic load shed because there was an electrical anomaly on one of the systems, you've now protected your devices. So there's an example of why intelligence adds real value.
Yeah. And I think especially, again, as we have all these other demands, as the services we're delivering, including to remote offices, are more critical to the business from sort of a revenue point of view, it's really important to have a small number of people be able to manage a whole lot of possible events.
That's right. You're reducing the cost of overhead for labor because you have one team that can remotely access most of their devices and be able to get information and assess how to resolve the problem.
Right.
You don't have to rely on remote hands locally on site. That reduces headcount.
So if somebody's interested in exploring kind of this intelligent PDU as a platform to do all these other things, what would you recommend as kind of a next action step?
Give us a call.
Yeah.
You could find us easily on our website. We are also here at the show, so come by our booth and really get some FaceTime with us, and we can work out a solution for you.
And if somebody wants to contact you directly, if they can find you on LinkedIn, are you open to that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can email me. I'm available 24/7 wherever I am in the world. You can get me.
Great. Thanks so much, Eddie, for your time.
Thanks so much, Leslie.
Again, Lenny Liebman of Information Week here at Interop ITX in Las Vegas. We've got more great interviews coming up, so please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX. I'm Sarah Peters. My next guest spoke today about fileless attacks, those malicious things that can be done without using malware at all. Chief Operations Officer and Head of Research at Triaging X, Vincent Wiefer. Vincent, thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. Good to be here.
You're talking about one of my favorite topics, or you talked about it already. Yeah. So let's start first with just what are fileless attacks? Give us some examples of them.
Okay, so what are fileless attacks and why do we care? So the very first reason we care is if we look at the industry data, it says fileless attacks are increasing at a rapid rate. They're basically evasion attacks. Rather than using malware to try and get inside your network, drop to disk, they're basically using exploits, staying in memory, or using tools we already have like PowerShell, PS Script, etc., to try and execute their commands in your environment. We know from the Ponemon Institute survey of last year that fileless attacks are 10 times more likely to succeed in your environment than malware file-based attacks. And 77% of our successful endpoint attacks were actually fileless last year. So we care a lot.
We definitely care a lot. So because they are processes that are already familiar to us, they're already using things that look completely normal and not malicious at all, they're able then, I imagine, to slip under our usual defenses. What do we do about that?
So there's actually a couple of different characteristics of fileless. One is living off the land, the dual-use tools you just referred to, which is using things like PowerShell. These are ubiquitous across the enterprise. We use them all the time. Using PS Exec, using other tools, even admin utility tools, to try and find web traversal information. Now, how did it come in? Very typically the same as most attacks, like a phishing attack. A SQL ejects on a website. You get a phishing email. It loads into memory. It could be a malicious flash file. It could be an Office file. So there's a combination of script. There's fileless, as in staying in memory, as well as the ability to use some of these tools to try and propagate, exploit, and to gain traction in the environment. And they've also got the ability to stay persistent by staying in registry or memory hives, etc. So these are sophisticated attacks that tend to be very successful. And from the defender's point of view, you got to change your thinking. So for example, traditionally we might say, well, it's a signed Microsoft application, it can do no harm. Well, actually, if the script that's executing it or instantiating is malicious, it can do harm. So then you got to change your application control, you got to think about who's got usage of that, what's it executing, and trust becomes very context-driven versus I'm giving you absolute trust based on the fact it's a signed executable.
So I have two different thoughts going on in my head. First, you said that they're very sophisticated attacks, but at the same time, they're not using exceptionally complicated malware or something like that. They're actually sometimes using very simple bits of code, even command line code or things like that. And then you also said that it completely changes the way that we think about trust. It completely changes the way that we think about access. So how do we then get to know our environment differently, get to know our users differently, change our access controls? I mean, is that the right place to start?
It really does come back to the basics around saying, first of all, if you're using endpoint security that's been deployed, let's say 2 years ago, chances are you don't have the next generation tools, things that can look in memory, exploit protection. Some of the tools that actually see some of the malicious scripts, some of the stream-based attacks, or the ability to recognize misuse of some of these dual-use tools. While they're now commonly available, they're not necessarily commonly deployed in the field yet. You've got to look at the access logs. Who's got access to them? When should it be using? You got to look at your SIM logs, and again, because many of them may be using normal traffic, they may be using tools like PuTTY, which can actually send out and connect to remote systems going, was that actually legitimate? Or what was the process behind that? So you can use a lot of the basic tools, but you have to think differently in terms of what you're looking for. You have to trust differently, but the securing your vulnerabilities, updating your tools, practicing the best security practices, looking at your logs, all of these things are equally applicable to fileless as they are to file-based threats.
But it's some of the basic hygiene kind of things that we've never been really all that good,
Exactly.
good at. We tend to be
Unfortunately,
a
yes,
little
it does go
lazy.
back to the basics, and it says you've got to do those things, but give yourself the right tools. So, for example, if you've got application control, you want to make sure it's a tool that doesn't ignore these tools, but can look at the right context around what's the sense you're looking at. You absolutely need tools which can look at malicious scripts. Can they scan it? Can they see what's going on? Can they see it in memory? Memory-based tools can actually recognize some of these things are staying in memory. Are they looking in the registry hives? Are they looking inside areas where they can be persistent? So in some cases, yes, updating your tool set, but also looking to make sure that you're looking for, is the use case for this tool correct, or am I simply excluding it because I'm using it as an admin tool?
Got it. When you spoke today, did you get a sense from the audience that this was something that they were familiar with and just wanted to know more about, or that this was a completely brand new concept to a lot of them?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I often feel that vendors get far more excited with these type of techniques than real people do. In the sense of, when you say something like ransomware or e-currency miners, people kind of understand the concept. Whereas Phylus is in many ways an evasion technique. It's something that's used to get around current security tools and techniques around us. So then part of my talk was to give them examples. Here's how it was used by a state actor in the case of, let's say, Dooku. Here's what was used by criminal gangs in the case of Carnabank and some of the techniques they've used. Here's what was used in NotPetya last year in terms of a ransomware attack. So once you start showing them examples of it used in the real world and the increase in activity and use of these tools, suddenly it kind of clicks towards, oh, then I actually care about this because here's what I care about in my environment.
Well, I'm very glad then that we had you here to tell them all about it.
Very welcome.
Thank you so much, Vincent. It's been a pleasure having you here and having you at Interop. Vincent Wiefer. Now, don't you move a muscle unless you have a session to go to, in which case, hot-footed over there right now. The rest of you stick around. More News Desk after the break. Welcome back to the Information Week News Desk, coming to you live from Interop ITX. We're streaming live at informationweek.com, IW News Desk until 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific. I'm Sarah Peters. Now, my next guest spoke this morning about leading through uncertainty. He is Global Head of Innovation and Customer Solutions at The Forum, Tom Rose.
That's wrong.
Okay, well, what is right?
It's Leadership Edge Consulting.
Okay, well, now we've got it. Pretend that whatever I said is not what I said, and we're going to change it.
It's right at the bottom.
To so principal at Leadership Edge Consulting. It's right here. But he's still named Tom Rose. Tom Rose. Thanks for being here. What you were speaking about today, as I mentioned, was leading through uncertainty.
Yeah.
So what specifically kind of what kind of uncertainty are you referring to?
Great question, Sarah. So the kind of uncertainty I'm referring to is uncertainty about the big factors that are impacting an organization: customers, technology, talent, sources of talent, regulatory change. All of those big factors are impacting organizations. They're disrupting them, and they're having to sort through the uncertainty that disruption creates.
Mm-hmm. Now, when there's just so many things going on in the world right now that are causing disruptions to businesses, if you are the person in charge, what are your main priorities to try to navigate your business through that and your people through that?
Great. So I think three things, really. You need to orient leaders to be focused on operating in a resilient and agile way. Mm-hmm. So that's a different model of leadership than we have customarily had, right? So think of the world of work today as permanent whitewater. So historically, what we were doing is preparing people to go on canoe trips across relatively quiet lakes. Now they're in kayaks, and it's permanent whitewater. So the water is turbulent, the path is uncertain, there are big obstacles in the way, sharp drops in elevation. It's turbulent.
Right.
Now the good news is, all of us know that people do kayaking for fun and adventure, right?
Sure.
So it is possible for human beings to navigate uncertain terrain successfully. We just need to bring that mentality into the way we do leadership, in the way we design work, and in the cultures we create.
So are you talking about more crisis management, or are you talking about just the way that we prepare ourselves? I mean, what do we need to do on a day-to-day basis that is different than the way that we used to do things?
Fair enough. So part of the answer is, unlike what we've done in the past, we need to be prepared differently.
Okay.
We need to orient differently. So if you're coming to a vacation spot and you're going to go kayaking, you're preparing differently than if you're going to go canoeing across the lake,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's a preparation involved. And then part of the preparation is teaching you how to recover. So what happens to kayakers is they'll flip over,
right?
And they learn how to pivot themselves right back on top again. So what's happening is you're being tipped over by the currents, but you're righting yourself real quickly because you've done it before and you know how to do it. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of, it's about being prepared for the moment, but there was the preparation that took place before you set out on your adventure that you equipped you with the ability to face that new environment successfully.
Got it. Now, since we're in an IT conference and we're thinking about IT, from a technology perspective, how are we preparing for those kinds of things? How do we, in a technological perspective, flip the kayak back over in the right way?
Great. So a couple of things. One is, instead of, on a very simple basis, instead of planning a project plan for a year or 18 months, planning in stages, mm-hmm. and then using each stage to learn something about the environment, to recheck in with customers, with senior level leaders, sort of reconfiguring how we even do project planning as an example. Who we listen to and how we listen to them is really, really important. How quickly and how often and regularly are we surveying the environment for changes that might impact us? The way we configure the units of work. So are we designing something from the ground up, or are we putting together Lego pieces? Are we designing our software capabilities so that they're Legos so we can mix and match quickly to meet a wide variety of needs? Or are we designing from the ground up on massive, long project cycles? It's probably not as wise. Are we putting diverse people in the teams? So if things are going to change, if you have people with different points of view in the project team, when the change comes, the likelihood that somebody knows something about that or is connected to somebody is much greater, so you can respond more quickly and agilely.
Well, it's a lot to absorb, Tom.
Yes, it is.
But it's been delightful talking to you,
Sure.
and I look forward to trying to grok all that on my own.
Thank you.
Tom Rose, stick around. The Information Week News Desk will be right back after the break. And we're back. It's the Information Week News Desk. I'm Sarah Peters, and with me now is one of my favorite people, senior editor of Dark Reading, Kurt Franklin. Kurt, thank you so much for being here.
It is an absolute pleasure to be with you.
Now, I get to see you or talk to you most of the time because we both work for Dark Reading, but today you've been spending a lot of time at Interop in the NOC.
Right, and for those who have been following Interop for years, the NOC is different now. No, it's no longer the center where all of the networking happens for the show floor and the conference. Instead, it is a demonstration of technology, and this year, the technology demonstration is all about IoT.
Not
looking
surprising.
at not only the infrastructure and the architecture, but the security of the IoT, and they've got some great demonstrations going on over there.
Such as?
Well, you know, one of the things they're looking at is how all the bits and pieces work together, because as was the history of Interop, you have all of these standards, all of these different ways of doing things, and it's not always obvious how to make any two items talk to one another. So what they've done is gone through and developed the software, they've done some coding, and they're following the data from the sensor or the switch or wherever, all the way through the gateway to the cloud, to the management, and back down to where actions are taking place. It's fascinating to see just how far data may have to travel just to make a light turn on.
And right now we're talking about turning lights on, and not too long from now we're going to be talking about much more complicated data sets and how far they're going to have to go.
Oh, absolutely. You know, the nice thing about IoT is that the principles are largely the same, whether you're talking very simple or much more complex. But you're absolutely right, because one of the things that is happening is that as we have more sensors, as we have more devices on the IoT, the data sets get richer. And we have people who are looking at how to go through and analyze that to get useful information from all the data. And of course, once you have all of that useful, valuable data, then you have to protect it.
Yeah.
And what they're finding is that there are some interesting things going on. For example, one of the devices they're using, they found, is encrypting the data, but it's sending it over a clear text channel.
Well, that's kind of defeating the purpose.
Well, so it's you know, a baby step in the right direction.
Right.
But could be further, and that's the kind of thing that practitioners need to know when they are putting together the bits, pieces, and plans for an IoT implementation of their own.
Now, you have been a part, in one way or another, of the Interop NOC for a long time, and I'm not going to say how long, because I don't actually know, but I know it's been a while. Are you, does this system of putting on these demos, has that been kind of an exciting change? And are there any demos specifically that stood out to you this year so far?
Well, the big thing is that it removes the pressure of a production network from the folks who are putting this on. And so they really can focus their attention on being an educational resource.
Yeah.
And I've been listening into some of the conversations as attendees stop by the NOC, and you know, they talk to them about what they've found, how they've put things together, tips for moving forward. And when you ask about, you know, things that stand out, I really do think, well, there's one over there that I really like. It is the internet connected IoT coffee maker, where you can, in this one device, it takes green coffee beans that go in the top, and coffee, wonderful high quality coffee comes out the bottom, all connected to the cloud and controlled through the IoT.
Well, heavens to Betsy. I can't imagine why that would be necessary, but it's good to know that it's here. Of all places, I'm glad that it's happening here. Kurt, thank you so much for stopping by. It's a pleasure, as always, to see you and speak to you.
Is a deep privilege. Thanks for having me on.
Kurt Franklin, my good friend. We'll be right back. The news desk soldiers on. Stick around. We are back and in the home stretch of the Information Week News Desk, live at Interop ITX. I'm Sarah Peters, and my next guest is at Interop to talk about another one of my favorite topics. Another day, another data breach, how the collection of data and metadata present cybersecurity risks. Program Manager of the National Cybersecurity Institute at Excelsior College, Dr. Amelia Estwick. Amelia, such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I think a lot of people, I hope a lot of people, are now familiar with the idea of data breaches. Hopefully, Equifax at least has taught them that. But what I don't know is of how many people are aware of metadata and how that poses a risk. So can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. So data is basically just disparate information, right? Sometimes it could be raw, it could be unprocessed. Metadata is actually the real treasure trove of information. Metadata gives us that context, who, what, when, why, where, how. So say you pick up your cell phone, you make a phone call. Metadata is not only the phone number, that's the data, but the metadata would be who you called, how long you was on the phone for, is your phone iPhone connecting to an Android. All this other information that is part of just a simple phone call.
Right. I think of that also when we talk about when somebody shares a little bit too much about themselves on LinkedIn, and particularly if they're an IT person and they're telling you about all of the different systems that they run. So when it comes to, say, how much information an employee shares about themselves on social media, even if it's their own personal accounts, does that kind of data sharing pose a threat to their employer? And if so, is that something that end users are even aware of?
Right. I think we don't realize that we think our social media accounts are just for our own personal purposes. They don't realize that information's being used against them. And since we're in this now sharing economy, right, we tend to overshare information. And I tell people, don't take it personal if your information's being warehoused and used in a nefarious way, because it's not about you. It's about where you may work or where you hold the keys to where you're at work. If you're a sysadmin, you're sharing that on your social media account, well then you may be targeted with information from your social media accounts to, say, a spear phishing email. So you can click on a malicious link and now you hold the keys, right? You have elevated privileges, and now an adversary who's looking to try to get into your company's network, they just got you basically based on a very social engineering tactic based on your social media information that you shared.
And now they are an admin too.
Right.
Something that is on a lot of people's minds right now is GDPR, which is coming up very soon.
Sure.
And I hope it's going to change the way a lot of organizations collect data, especially personally identifiable information, because it is kind of just a liability. If you don't have it, you can't lose it, right? With the people that you've been speaking to, have they started to make that connection of just collecting less data in the first place, or putting more controls on the kind of data that they collect, or is that change not happening yet?
Well, it's going to have to because GDPR imposes some serious fines when you're non-compliant. So I think companies are realizing, and you're going to start seeing, all of us are going to start seeing as end users, privacy agreement updates that they're going to want us to acknowledge, right? There's going to be more ways where you can opt out of possibly sharing your information. You just saw Facebook CEO had announced this yesterday, actually, that Facebook will have an opt-out, will allow users to opt out of some of their data sharing practices. So you will see companies changing how they do business based on GDPR. No one's going to want to pay those fines. It hits the bottom line. And guess what? It's a win-win for data privacy activists, right? So all of us who are kind of teed off of our information being breached and used for data brokers and by cyber criminals, like to see this change, right? Because companies need to be accountable for the information that they house. So there you go.
So if you're one of the people here who is responsible for this data and keeping it secure, what recommendations would you give to them so that they can mitigate some of these risks?
Well, I think it has to go down back to the user, right? We can't expect, unfortunately, in the construct that we're in now, maybe that's going to take a while to have the certain security protocols in place to protect the data, and hopefully that will trickle into budgets and the right practices by companies. But I tell individuals, so you can make sure you have the right practices to mitigate, is not to overshare, to opt out when you can opt out, and definitely monitor and manage your online information. And there are ways to do that by various software applications with your browser usage, or you can just contact the companies and say, I want to opt out. And there are ways to do that. But you definitely have to take charge of your information that's online.
Well, that's excellent advice. Amelia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
It's
for
been a
having
pleasure
me.
having you. That's Amelia Estwick. Still more to come with you until 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific. We're here at informationweek.com/IW News Desk. A little bit more from Interop after the break. And we're back. This is the Information Week News Desk. I'm Sarah Peters, and our last guest of the day is doing a lot of work at Interop ITX this year. One of several talks she's doing is tomorrow afternoon on what talent management could have in common with personalized healthcare. So, we're going to start with that and some of your other fascinating work. Intel data scientist Janitha Gray. Janitha, thank you so much for being here and being my last guest.
Thanks for having me.
You were telling me that you've been focusing your work on people analytics, which I think is fascinating. So let's just define for people what you mean, what kind of problems you've been trying to solve, what kind of questions you've been trying to answer using analytics.
Okay, so the idea of people analytics is that employers have a lot of information about potential employees, current employees, and past employees in the same way that a marketing group might have information about potential current and past customers and can build different models of information about their customers. In HR, we're trying to do the same with employees and better understand employees, understand what their career is or could be like, understand what cultural things are happening inside the corporation, understand retention issues, understand how to best plan the workforce for the future to meet future needs. So we're trying in the same ways that other fields have picked up data and are doing things with it. It's the same thing we're trying to do in HR.
I think it sounds tremendous, but I haven't heard about a lot of organizations putting that kind of thing to work yet. I hear about a lot of people complaining about all of the problems that you said that this could solve. What, how in your experience is some of this being put to use now?
So one of the biggest areas that is having the biggest impact is in the area of diversity in tech. Companies have started reporting their numbers, but in people analytics, we want to take it beyond just reporting numbers. And we want to look at what changes can we make? Can we put together different kinds of data, the quantitative that describes the numbers, but also the qualitative that describes what's happening and how people feel, and put that together and make a plan to really change things and change the makeup of a company so that it's more diverse and it really meets the business needs of the company.
Well, how do you go about that, quantifying how people feel? Well, getting qualitative data like that.
So most qualitative data comes from surveys, but it can also come from focus groups. If you have a particular question you're trying to address, then we also do use some focus groups.
Great. Now specifically about your session tomorrow, what does talent management have in common with personalized healthcare? Help me understand that parallel.
So I'm a researcher, and as a researcher, I like to look at other areas that are using the types of tools that I would also use and understand how they've used them and then figure out how to extend them to a problem that I'm interested in. So if we look at what's happening in healthcare and the amount of data that they have and how they can use it to help personalize something that will make you healthier, something you can personally work on with your doctor, a specific diet for you, or a specific health plan, or a specific way to target a medical problem you're having. They've built that through data. So I'm taking that same idea and thinking about careers and how you would build that with data, but making it more personalized. Instead of saying, oh, the way you become CEO is you do job A and then job B and then job C, and in 20 years you'll be there. Instead, we're looking at where do people want to go, what are the different ways you can get there, what pieces can you pull in, what skills and networks do people have that they can use, what motivates them, the same types of things that you would use to set up your personal health plan.
I love that idea, but I have no idea how you do that. So, tell me a bit more about the technology and how you construct that, because the first thing that I'm thinking is the person who might be hiring me, the person who might be putting me in that CEO role, will be looking at my resume, at my experience. What will they be defining me in the same way that I would want them to? Do you understand what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
so how will my career path as defined by this data science approach be acceptable to somebody who isn't that forward thinking?
So there's a couple of things. One is that technology is changing fast, and if I think about what jobs were available when I started working and what jobs are available now, they're very different. The people analytics job didn't exist when I first started working. So we have to keep in mind that if you sign up for one thing, it doesn't even mean that job might be there in the future. So we need to make sure that people have flexible skills and that we're not just putting them on a path that may or may not exist. And then the other thing is that when we think about people's careers and personalizing it, that's where we bring in some of the other interview questions that you might get, like the where do you want to be in 5 years, the what are the other soft skills you've learned, what are things that excite you, what are things that you would like to learn more about, what are things that you are not interested in, to build it and make it more personalized for you. And then we can take information about people that are similar to you and see success and failure in their careers and understand this class was very helpful in getting them this next step or place in their career, and maybe this class wasn't as helpful, things like that.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and I definitely want to know more, especially as wherever my career goes next. I want to know exactly what I should be doing. Janitha, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was great.
Janitha Gray.
Thank you.
That is our show for today. Thanks ever so much for being with us. The news desk starts again, rocking and rolling again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 Pacific, right here. And until then, I'm Sarah Peters at Interop for Information Week. See you tomorrow.